So I've been really thinking about this topic of the difference between intelligence on one hand and wisdom on the other hand, which is the topic of my most recent essay titled Saving the Matter from Itself, i.e., saving intelligence from itself. And I think it's really interesting to think about the difference between the two in light of the explosion of intelligence that we saw in the artificial intelligence domain, or in light of the different discoveries that happened in neuroscience in the past 20 to 30 years, or at least people's perceptions on how we actually progressed in neuroscience. So I really think it's interesting to look at human exceptionalism through the lens of contrasting those two ideals, let's say, that humans perceive all the time or think about all the time. So I really think it's interesting to kind of start with the title that I actually named my essay, which is Saving the Master from Itself. And the reason why I named it that way is to kind of show that intelligence is almost like an infinite cup in a sense, where the more data you give it, the more it actually takes. And then wisdom comes along and then stops this process of filling the cup all the time at the right moment, let's say. So I think that's the general framework of the essay, and this is why I actually named it this way. So the way I think about intelligence is that, as I said, it kind of drinks from the fire hose as long as you give it more data. The more data you give it, the more it actually flourishes. And I don't really think that that necessarily leads to more knowledge. And this is where wisdom comes along and kind of taps intelligence on the back and is like, listen, taking more data all the time is not necessarily the best thing to do when it comes to knowledge, because sometimes we need to facilitate for the dynamism of the world. So, for example, if you're trying to understand a certain person, from an intelligence perspective, getting all of the data of their past and their present and kind of exhaustively putting all the data in front of you would be the optimal way to actually understand the person. However, if you look at it from a wisdom perspective, you're like, okay, maybe taking the holistic past of the person is not actually the best thing to understand them, because they might unravel themselves in new ways in front of you because of the nature of the dynamic and complex world. And by extension, taking the data from the past and shoving that person through that lens or through the lens of that data might not be the best way to understand them. So wisdom can come along here and say, okay, it's not necessarily the best way to take all the data, all the exhaustive data of the person to understand them more. There is another way where you have some context about the person, and then you let them unfold in front of you, and then you see the new ways that they're actually unfolding in front of you, and that way, by extension, you can understand them more. So I think it's really interesting to think about how wisdom comes along and limits intelligence from taking more and more data, because sometimes that doesn't necessarily lead to more knowledge or understanding about the dynamic, complex world, because the world is always inventing itself in new ways in a sense, and the data is like more static. And I think intelligence is always like very thirsty for more data, more data, more data, but I don't think that necessarily leads to more knowledge about the world, as I explained in the previous example. And also, as an extension to this idea, I think it's really interesting to think about how our neuroscientific structure, or our human nature, let's say, kind of goes along with this hypothesis to a certain extent, that more data is not necessarily more knowledge. So we kind of forget all the time. And people think about it as a bug. But I think when we look at it through the lens that we talked about, forgetting might seem like a feature to understand the dynamic world, since forgetting that static data that kind of makes us project to the world more than understand it is not necessarily a bug, but actually might be a feature if we look at it through the lens of wisdom and intelligence, as we saw. So I think it's really interesting to think about how our human nature is kind of going along with this hypothesis that more data is not necessarily more knowledge, since we forget and we kind of have emotions that make us disregard the data in a sense. And people, as I said, think about it as a bug, but I don't think it's necessarily a bug. Sometimes it could be looked at as a feature in so many ways to understand the dynamism of the world. So I think it's a very interesting way to kind of look at those two. And the way I think about it is that they're both necessary and also complementary in a lot of ways. So we don't need only intelligence to understand the dynamic world. We also need wisdom at the same time. And I think there is almost like a worship of intelligence nowadays, where people over appreciate it in a sense, and over estimate how much it could actually understand the world on its own. And I think as soon as we look at that lens that we saw this contrast between intelligence and wisdom, we can see that there's a more holistic way of looking at the world where wisdom or more data does not necessarily mean, or let's say intelligence kind of operating at maximum is not necessarily the best way to understand the world, because intelligence is always trying to look at the world through the lens of data, which is, as we said, more static and all those different things. So, in a nutshell, I think it's good to kind of summarize intelligence as the more you give it, the more it takes, and then wisdom as the more you give it, the more it looks at that thing and then assesses whether it's actually a good thing to drink or not. So they kind of battle with each other in a sense, and then it ends up being like the amalgamation of wisdom and intelligence ends up being the best way to kind of understand the dynamic and complex world, rather than just looking at the world through the lens of intelligence.